Come, let us worship together. Let us open our minds to the challenge of reason. Open our hearts to the healing of love. Open our lives to the calling of conscience. Open our souls to the comfort of joy. Astonished by the miracle of life, grateful for the gift of fellowship, confident in the power of living faith, we are here gathered. Come, let us worship together.
Now for a little meditation. I'd like you to sit back in your chairs and relax. Close your eyes, if you will, and take a few deep breaths. Try and get into a meditative state. Breathing deeply in and out. And as you become relaxed, I'd like you to think of all the wonderful things in your life. No matter how small or how big. Perhaps sitting outside in your garden on a summer morning, holding a loved one's hand as you walk down the street, that good feeling inside when you've helped someone in need. Whether these gifts come from God or are part of our nature as human beings doesn't matter. What does matter is that they and many other gifts should be cherished and never taken for granted. Feel the life force flowing within you as you celebrate what life offers you. The reading today comes from A Chosen Faith, which many of you are familiar with, and if you're not, it's sort of a primer on Unitarian Universalism, written by John Behrens and Forrest Church, who are two of the most celebrated Unitarians of the last half century. The part that I'm going to read today is from the chapter called Beyond Idolatry, which was written by Forrest Church. And in it, Church talks about the Humanist Manifesto and why humanism is misunderstood by people of various religious persuasions. In 1933, a group of religious humanists, most of whom were from the Chicago area, many of whom were Unitarians, together composed a brief document called the Humanist Manifesto, outlining the basic principles of humanism. It was not designed to be an anti-religious statement, but as a testament to the religious spirit as it might best be expressed in our time. The word humanism is blasphemy to many deeply religious people. Even today, it suggests godlessness, sacrilege, and immorality. Yet the Humanist Manifesto is a profoundly spiritual document. Yes, it rejects superstition, and it expresses a deep commitment to the commonweal. Far from being anti-religious, this manifesto proclaimed, and this is a quote, "Today our larger understanding of the universe, our scientific achievements, and our deeper appreciation of the kinship of all people have created a situation which requires a new statement of the means and purposes of religion." Church goes on to say that God doesn't make us do anything. We are responsible for our own destiny, and we are capable of making it better. The goal of humanism is a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. The humanist teachings counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us of the idolatries of the mind and the spirit. The inclusion of a warning against idolatries of the mind and spirit is not an afterthought. It is absolutely critical to the integrity of our faith, protecting even science and rationalism from becoming idols. When I was growing up as a Roman Catholic in Buffalo, New York, atheists were about on the same level as child molesters, which is probably not something the Roman Catholic Church would like to use as an analogy these days. By the way, if you haven't seen Spotlight, the movie, it's really terrific and kind of sad. I believe in God because everybody I knew believed in God. My parents believed in God. My friends believed in God. And, of course, the nuns and the priests told us we had to believe in God or else I'll suffer the eternal fires of hell. Our belief was an unquestioned belief, except for the occasional question about if God exists, why doesn't he prevent evil and suffering? And, of course, the priests and the nuns had an answer handy. It usually was some variation on God has this master plan which we mortals can't possibly fathom. Translation, shut up and believe. After my freshman year in college in Philadelphia, I stopped going to church because Catholicism didn't seem to make any sense to me anymore. But I still believed in God, sort of. Actually, I didn't think much about God or religion for the next 25 years or so because I didn't think there was a religion that meshed with my beliefs in spirituality and ethics and morality. And then I went to All Souls Church in New York, which if you haven't been to, you should try next time you're in New York. It's I like to call it the Cadillac of Unitarian churches, which is, Unitarians don't drive Cadillacs, but the Volvo of the Prius. It's the church where Forrest Church was pastor, and he was there when we visited, and I got a chance to meet him, which was great. And I was amazed at how relevant the sermons were, and even more amazed at their adult education programs, which covered a whole range of spirituality and ethics and morality. You name it. We talked about the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We talked about the psychology of Abraham Lincoln. And it all revolved around how we should think about spirituality, God. And the nice thing about it was that God was optional. And I continued this kind of believing in Unitarian Universalism when we went back to Philadelphia in 2000, and we joined the Unitarian Society of Germantown in Philadelphia. And at the time, there was a interim minister by the name of Matthew McNaught. And I remember something he said really stuck with me. He said, when it comes right down to it, we're all agnostics because nobody knows for sure if God exists. I thought, well, that makes sense. I guess I'm an agnostic. And I was happily an agnostic for the next several years, all the while thinking about this whole issue of God. Reading about God, thinking, listening, more than I ever did as a Roman Catholic. And the more I thought about God, the more I continued to discount his existence. Which is kind of ironic, don't you think? And then finally, a few years ago, I said to myself, pal, you're no longer an agnostic. You are an atheist. And so when I announced this to my wife, she said, you can't be an atheist. You don't know if God exists or not. And I said, you're right. I don't know. But I believe God doesn't exist. And why can't I believe that God doesn't exist just the way people believe God does exist? That's why they call it faith. And there's a book that I'm going to read from in the closing words called The Atheist, written by Chris Stedman, who was in a similar situation to me, grew up as a Catholic. He had the additional burden of being gay. But he, like I, believed there was a place for religion in the world, even though we didn't believe in the existence of God. And the word faithist is actually a derogatory term that comes from fundamental atheists. Yes, there are such people. And like Christian fundamentalists and Muslim fundamentalists, there is a purity that they believe exists among atheists if you really want to call yourself an atheist. And that means the total disregard of religion. And so when Stedman was at some atheist meeting and talked about his particular viewpoint, they said, well, you're not an atheist. You're a faithist. And that, to them, was a derogatory term, but it seems to make sense to me. My wife and I were going to go to the National Atheist Convention in last April in Memphis. And I thought that would be a good time to learn more about atheism and get some good barbecue, which is always important. But when we looked at the program, almost everything on the program was about how to convince other people to be atheists. And I thought, well, that's not me. I mean, I get enough proselytizing from Christians. I don't need it from atheists. And I also thought when I was an agnostic, and even as I became an atheist, I thought more about Jesus and how he talked about the kinds of things that Christians are supposed to do and seem not to do so much. And the kinds of things that Pope Francis is talking about today, telling people to come back to the things that Jesus talked about and stop demonizing people. In my journey to atheism, I came to the conclusion that there are 4 reasons why people become atheists. The first one is what I call the legacy reason. And that is that you believe in God because your parents believe in God, because their parents and their parents before them. After hearing one of my sermons on a podcast, my brother Russ, who is still a staunch Catholic, said, you obviously believe God is in an entirely different way from the way we were brought up. That certainly is your right and privilege, he said. And though he didn't say it, the message underlying was clear. Where had I gone wrong? But the reality is many of us don't have the same beliefs as our parents. Many of us, like myself, for example, my parents were working class folks, didn't graduate from high school, worked through the Depression, survived World War II, and aside from my father's stint in the Pacific in World War II, neither one of them traveled much. They lived in an all-white neighborhood, an Italian-American all-white neighborhood at that. So they didn't have much contact with a lot of people that we have come in contact with over the years, minorities, just people of every persuasion, whether it's religion, race, or ethnicity. And so it wasn't surprising that they had certain stereotypes that I no longer believe in. The second justification for God is the Bible. There it is, right at the very beginning. God created the earth in 6 days. Case closed, right? Well, the Bible, as we know, says a lot of other stuff that we don't believe in, like Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt and Jonah being swallowed by the whale. But even beyond these fantastical stories, why should we believe a document, or certainly literally believe a document, written by people however thousands of years ago, people who really didn't know much about the world, who wrote this document to sort of explain why things happened because they didn't know, as well as trying to keep the troops in line with things like the Ten Commandments and the rules in Leviticus, which were written when the Jews were under the thumb of the Babylonians, and the Babylonians were pretty wild and crazy guys, and they didn't want people to start acting like Babylonians, so they had all these rules like keeping kosher. But don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of good stuff in the Bible, a lot of good lessons in the Bible, just as there are a lot of good lessons in a lot of other works of fiction. And in particular, I like to view the New Testament the way Thomas Jefferson did. Thomas Jefferson looked at the New Testament and he thought, there's a lot of extraneous stuff in here. I'm going to cut it all out and just take the stuff that makes sense, the stuff that Jesus said about how we should treat each other, and I'm going to paste that into my own version of the Bible, which has now come to be known as the Jefferson Bible. How many of you have heard of the Jefferson Bible? Well, the most recent version of it, incidentally, has a foreword written by Forrest Church. And so all of the smoke and mirrors about Jesus is stripped out of the Jefferson Bible. Now, speaking of Jefferson, my brother Russ noted that in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." He then asked, what kind of God do you think Jefferson was referring to? Was it some amorphous blob of molecules that rearranged themselves during the Big Bang? It was a great story, by the way, that Jen read. Or was it the supreme God of majesty and might, of infinite intelligence, compassion, and mercy? Well, I was happy to point out to Russ that Jefferson was a Unitarian, nominally at least, and that he was also a deist who believed in a creator of the world, but not one who governed our conduct afterwards or made determinations on whether we get into heaven or hell. I also pointed out that he didn't use the word God, he used the word creator, which was consistent with being a deist, and that all men did not include women and didn't include African Americans. More importantly, I wrote, the issue isn't who or what created us as much as how we treat each other. And too many God-fearing people don't do what their book says they should do. Now, the third justification for God is what I call how do you explain this justification? You know, this is sort of the creationist viewpoint. And it's so the world is so fantastic and magical and majestic. It had to be the work of a creator. There was a guy who wrote, I can't remember where this was, that he said, how could Einstein come up with a formula for E equals mc squared if the earth was created randomly? Einstein, by the way, was an agnostic. Well, my answer to those questions is quite simple. Why? Why? Because the earth and the universe are so complex, so majestic, and so huge, do we have to believe it came from the work of one divine individual? And there's an interesting poll that came out, Pew survey came out last month, and it said that more atheists are awed by the majesty of the universe than Christians. And I guess it's because Christians say, God, big deal. And the fourth reason for believing in God is very primal, and that is fear. I'm sure you've heard somebody say, and maybe you've said it yourself, what if there is a God and I don't believe in him? I'm doomed for eternity. Well, first you have to believe there is an eternity, which is not a given among we UUs. As a matter of fact, only 20% of UUs believe in heaven, and only 10% believe in hell. I think that difference is the universalists kicking up the numbers a little bit. But even if there is a heaven, I don't believe that you have to believe in God to get there. But unfortunately, my sister Maria, who has become a Christian fundamentalist over the years, frequently tells me, good works are not enough. So no matter all the good things you do on this earth, how kind you were, how much you did for society, it doesn't make any difference unless you have Jesus as your personal Savior. So you could be a combination of Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, and the Dalai Lama, but unless you have Jesus as your personal Savior, you're going south. My brother Russ felt the same way, and he said, you don't want to believe that a loving God would not turn away anyone who rejects him? Sorry, I do. Why? Because he said it. It's his world. It's his rules. We don't get to vote on it. And I said, Russ, that's some God you got there. I also wondered why God's self-esteem was so fragile that he constantly need us to pay fealty to him. I mean, he's God. Why does he need that? It's sort of like the loyalty oaths during the McCarthy era, you know? Are you now, or have you ever been an atheist? Have you ever consorted with known atheists? The list of famous atheists is a pretty long one and includes people in just about every category you can think of, from Warren Buffett to Kevin Bacon, Thomas Edison to Edgar Allan Poe, Susan B. Anthony to Mark Zuckerberg. Now, would a God who gave us these talented people, who did so much for the world, except for Facebook, would he condemn them just because he didn't believe in them? People like my sister Maria and my brother Russ think of atheists as kind of cold and soulless people, but that has not been my experience. As a matter of fact, I think recent events have shown us that people of faith can be pretty violent. A few years ago, I took a poll at our New Year's Day dinner, which we've held every year, we stopped doing it a couple of years ago, for about 30 years, and always invited our closest friends. And because I was thinking about writing a sermon on atheism, I asked them what their belief in God was. 9 said they didn't believe in God. 3 were agnostic. 1 said he believed in God. He was the one that voted for George W. Bush. Twice. Well, a recent survey by the Pew Group confirmed my informal poll. It said that along with the rise of religiously unaffiliated Americans, many of whom believe in God, there has been a corresponding increase in the number of atheists. The share of Americans who identify as atheists has roughly doubled over the past several years, which explains why atheists are no longer at the bottom of the kinds of people Americans will vote for president. It used to be that the last type of person they would vote for president was an atheist. Now, we're still below Muslims, Mormons, gays, and lesbians, But we're ahead of one other group now. Socialists. Sorry, Bernie. May it be so. Amen and thank you.